First of all, to all of our guests who have travelled to be here, thank you. Thank you for coming to Ireland. More than 300 of you have had to get on a plane to leave your businesses. You're busy, significant people in those businesses, and you've chosen to come to Ireland, in some cases for a number of days, to debate and discuss with us sustainability, what this country is trying to do in that space, and also to challenge one another, I hope, on the enormous challenges that many of your companies will face, but more importantly, that many of your countries will face in terms of food production and its sustainability and its security in the future. I think that it's important for me to put some context on why I and Aidan Cotter and a number of others really wanted to hold this conference here this year. Ireland has a long and at times very painful history as a food producer. Less than 2 lifetimes ago, as our Taoiseach this morning reminded you and as Aidan Cotter reminded you earlier, we had starvation on this island. We saw 1 million people starve on an island that had 8 million people on it. Another 1 million people died from disease related to malnutrition and lack of food. Another 2 million people during that period left Ireland because they couldn't feed themselves here. And they went on what we now call coffin ships in many cases, because many of them died on that journey. That was not so long ago. We have transited from that tragedy in terms of food security and safety of production to now being a country that produces enough food for 10 times our population. We are supplying 178 countries now with food product across a whole series of different spectrums. And we want to do more. We have, as a country, put a roadmap in place for our food and drinks industry as a nation. Many of you who are leaders in large companies have done that for your companies. We are trying to do it as a country. And we're trying to bring an industry, a scientific research grouping, arms of the state with us on that journey. And so the Origin Green concept, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, has not been plucked out of thin air as some kind of marketing gimmick to get people to talk about the green island that is a food producer. It is an ambition or a journey that we have committed ourselves to following a process of discussion and negotiation and argument around what makes Ireland different in terms of how we produce food, and what can we do to become a genuine world leader in terms of leading by example on how food can and should be produced at a time when the planet needs to produce vastly more food than we currently produce over a relatively short period of time. And so the context for this is globally. By 2030, we have to find a way of producing about 50% more food in volume terms. On current trends, that will take about 30% more water than we currently use. And agriculture and food production already uses 70% of available fresh water. And it'll take also, on current consumption trends in terms of lifestyle, about 50% more power generation also. At a time when we have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to limit the effects of climate change as opposed to stop them, at a time when we have to adapt to that change that we know is already happening, and at a time when we have less available agricultural land in which to do it because of desertification and growing urbanization in so many countries, and at a time when every week that passes, there is a population the equivalent of Dublin City, where you are now, being born, extra in terms of mouths to feed. That is some challenge for a generation, and it's some responsibility for a generation to ensure that those that follow us are not fighting over precious, scarce resources and killing each other in that aim. And so what we are talking about in many ways is a deadly serious challenge that many of the companies we've heard speak about today are giving genuine leadership on, but it's not enough. And we all know that. And so what I wanted to spend a few minutes doing was maybe outlining as a policymaker the decisions that are being taken at a European level at the moment to try and deal with some of these challenges. Because this must be a partnership between mature politics that is actually not making decisions for tomorrow, but for 5 and 10 years' time, and also businesses and companies that want to be around in 10 years' time and need to put strategies in place that can ensure that they are there and their consumers and customers are protected. I had the privilege for the first 6 months of this year of chairing the Council of Ministers for both Agriculture and Fisheries at a time when we were finalising the agricultural food production policy for Europe for the next 7 years, called the Common Agricultural Policy. We finalised a political agreement with the European Parliament and the European Commission at the end of June. And actually, and this is why this is so current, that deal was finalised in full 48 hours ago in Brussels, where the Common Agricultural Policy was signed off on. We also finalised last May the Common Fisheries Policy with the other two institutions in the European Union. And it was both a privilege and a challenge and a responsibility to be in the chair for those discussions. But I can tell you it was the most rewarding work I've ever done as a politician. Because where we began in terms of the Common Agricultural Policy was the wrong place about 2 or 3 years ago. Traditionally, the European Union, in terms of food production, has taken a protectionist approach that has essentially ignored international trends outside of the European Union and has essentially deliberately limited supply in order to create artificially high prices to ensure that producing food in Europe, which is more expensive in terms of its production and costs, is viable. And rightly so, we insisted on environmental protection in that process so that consumers could feel good about themselves in terms of essentially sponsoring the financial support of food production in the European Union in a way that they were comfortable with, as regards animal husbandry, as regards protecting the environment and biodiversity, and so on. And those objectives were driving the new CAP as well, and so they should. But what was being ignored was the new realities of global food security and the way in which this train is going in terms of the challenges that we know we're going to face as regards shortage of food if we do not find a way to produce more. And so the initial approach was pretty straightforward. We want to respond to climate change challenges by ensuring that we reduce emissions from agriculture. Good. We want to ensure that we continue to protect biodiversity. Good. But of course, the solution which people were leaning towards was the way to do that was more extensification of agriculture. Where is the challenge in being sustainable by producing less from the same resource? And we have changed that by introducing a much more controversial and tougher debate across the European Union by actually challenging that thinking and saying, yes, we must protect the environment, yes, we must find ways to ensure that we continue to promote biodiversity, that we protect waterways, that we limit, where possible, greenhouse gas emissions from a sector that is contributing a significant amount, in Ireland's case, outside of our very large companies, which are in the traded sector, for those of you who understand how greenhouse gas emissions trading works in the European Union, 40% of Ireland's greenhouse gas emissions now comes from agriculture, or close to it. But the real challenge is, how do we do all of those things in terms of responsible protection of the environment and the animals that produce our food, while at the same time producing significantly more? And that is, I'm glad to say, where the argument was won and the amendments and changes were made to the CAP process towards the end of that debate. And so we're essentially doing four things that are slightly different to the CAPs or the Common Agricultural Policies of the past. We are, for the first time, linking to direct financial supports for farmers an obligation to meet a basic green benchmark or environmental protection benchmark in the food production system. In other words, farmers will lose 30% of their direct supports in the European Union unless they protect permanent pasture, unless they have real crop diversity in terms of how they produce arable crops, and unless they set aside, essentially, 5% of their farm or of their landmass for what's called an ecological focus area, the kind of areas that can promote the sort of biodiversity that we heard about earlier. Now, those three elements of greening of the CAP don't solve all problems, not by a long shot. But they are a basic benchmark above which every farmer in the European Union who wants to get financial supports for producing food will have to cross or have to get over. That's a good thing. Secondly, we are promoting generational change in agriculture and food production across the European Union. At the moment, believe it or not, even in Ireland, where agriculture is a huge industry, it's a huge political lobby, and we are producing, as I say, enough food for 10 times our population, only 6% of our farmers are under the age of 35. We have more farmers over the age of 75 than under the age of 35. That is no basis to meet the challenges that we face in terms of expansion and growth and sustainability and environmental protection and all of the other things that we want to do in agriculture. It is no basis for understanding and delivering on the potential of Origin Green. And so we are positively discriminating in favour of young farmers under the age of 40, and every country in the European Union is mandated to do that in their support systems in terms of direct financial supports for farmers, which is the basis of the CAP. We are also moving away from the protectionism of the past. The idea that the way to keep milk prices high in the European Union is to stop farmers producing more milk. Surely that is yesterday's thinking. And that is reflected in the new CAP. So from April 2015 onwards, we will see an end to milk quotas, whereby countries are given a certain quota of milk that they are allowed to produce and no more. And if you go over that quota, you're fined by the European Union. That thinking is over. And so after 2015, we will see a significant expansion, in my view, of the dairy industry in this country and in a number of other European countries, predominantly to meet demand outside of the European Union, because the European Union has a pretty mature market for dairy consumption. And we have a plan, which I'll tell you about in a second, to actually grow dairy production in a 5-year period in volume terms by 50%. 50%, which is by far the most ambitious of any country in the European Union. And you might think that that isn't attainable. But think about this for a second. When quotas were introduced to the European Union in 1983, Ireland had the same size dairy industry as New Zealand. We have a similar landmass, we have similar weather conditions, and we have similar family farms in terms of structure. Ireland produced 4 billion litres of milk per year in 1983. So did New Zealand. New Zealand now produces just under 20 billion litres of milk per year. Ireland still produces just over 4. So the growth potential is there, The question is, how do we do that in a way that is sustainable, in a way that protects all of the things that the Common Agricultural Policy must protect and that we pay farmers to ensure are protected? How do we do that? We do that through education, through innovation, through new ways of doing things, and most importantly, we measure progress step by step by step. So that when we make claims to international buyers who are looking for Irish dairy produce, we can actually back up what we're saying with facts and figures. Because the days of selling Ireland as a green island on an emotional basis, because it looks nice, are still there. But now you need much more on top of that in terms of the science behind it. And that is what we're talking about today. Of course, it's not just about milk either. We're doing away with sugar quotas too. Some of you will be glad to hear, probably Mars will be glad to hear. There'll be a lot more sugar around in the European Union, I suspect, after 2017. But likewise, the market intervention tools, which were predominantly about protecting an internal market in the past, are now being removed or only used in the case of market collapse, so that Europe can be a net food exporter at some stage in the future, rather than continuing to be a net food importer to a huge extent. Because to be perfectly honest with you, we have been fundamentally dishonest in the food industry in the European Union in terms of how it actually functions and where it sources its food. We have produced food in a very sustainable and very responsible way here, but it hasn't been enough to feed our consumers. And we have made up the difference by importing cheap product from other parts of the world and largely ignoring where that comes from or how it's produced. I'm exaggerating a little bit for effect because I think that is now changing rapidly, but that has been the basis of the approach in the past. And the final difference then is we have real flexibility in the Common Agricultural Policy now, whereby countries can actually design and tailor their own support systems to suit the way in which they produce food. And that's a huge change from the past. But, you know, if you look at Sweden and you look at Cyprus and all of the countries in between, all 28 of them, they are fundamentally different in terms of how they produce food as regards the structure of farms, the climate, the soil they operate under, and you need to give governments a flexibility to be able to design a sustainable system of supports to allow responsible food production. And that, I'm glad to say, the combination of those four changes, in my view, have modernized the approach towards food production in the European Union at a primary farming level in a way that is very positive. The second thing that, and I was delighted to see the seafood industry represented here today, because often at conferences like this one, they are dominated by dairy, they're dominated by beef, and in many of your countries, they're dominated by products that dominate your markets. But the seafood sector in Ireland is a hugely important sector, and the seafood industry in the European Union is about to go through the most fundamental change that it has gone through, arguably, in the last 50 years. We agreed a new common fisheries policy at a European Union level. The industry have, I am glad to say, by and large bought into that, and they've done it for all the right reasons. And for those of you who don't understand the European seafood industry, first of all, we have to import from other parts of the world 70% of the seafood that's consumed in the European Union. But what is fished in the European Union, in the past, has not necessarily been fished in a sustainable way. If you look at Ireland, for example, and the waters that we're responsible for within the European Union, we catch about 1.2 million tons of fish. When I say we, I'm talking about all of the different international fleets fishing in Irish waters. French, Spanish, Portuguese, British, Irish, Dutch, and others. And that is what is actually landed on the quayside. But up until now, there's probably somewhere between 400 and 600,000 tons of fish caught and dumped over the side in discards because fishermen haven't had the quota to catch it. and it is legally tipped over the side of boats, dead. Marketable fish in many cases, young juvenile fish in other cases. And you talk about sustainability and waste. Fish that would have a similar value to the entire fish exports out of this country, dumped over the side, dead. We have a new common fisheries policy, which is committing the industry and governments to actually ensure that quotas in terms of the amount of fish that fishermen are allowed catch will be set on the basis of science, on the basis of an international agreement around a concept called MSY, maximum sustainable yield. In other words, allowing a fishing industry to catch the maximum that is commercially viable while at the same time protecting the fundamentals of that fish stock and its ability to grow. We are committing to ending the discarding of fish across the European Union in a phased basis over the next 7 years. Less, actually. And so what we have committed to politically, and now we have to deliver in partnership with the industry, is an extraordinarily ambitious program for change in the fishing industry, which in my view will guarantee that we still have a wild fish fishing industry in 5 and 10 years' time. And that, in my view, is a significant contribution to the raw sustainability of fish production. And actually, when you look at the demands for seafood internationally, you are talking extraordinary growth in terms of consumption demand of seafood. In and around, by 2020, in and around 10 million extra tons of fish per year increase year on year in terms of demand for seafood consumption worldwide. And when you think of all of Ireland's waters, all 900,000 square kilometres of it, and there's a little over 1 million tons of fish caught there each year, that starts to put it into perspective. And of course, EU policy around agricultural production and fishing needs to be measured against our ambitions on other sustainability measurement tools, like, for example, climate change policy. And in my view, we have a fundamental conflict here. We have a climate change policy that was put in place before the real strategic thinking was happening in Europe around food security. And so you have, in my view, a mistake in policy where a country like Ireland has a strict commitment in terms of meeting targets on greenhouse gas emissions that applies to the food production sector in the same way that it applies, for example, to energy use and transport. And so essentially we are being pressurized to reduce food production in an effort to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, even though in that food production we may be producing food at the lowest carbon footprint on the planet, in the case of dairy production. And by doing that, we will be simply transferring production to other parts of the world which may have a much higher carbon footprint in terms of the very same food production. That makes no sense. It makes no sense to me, and it makes no sense to anybody who looks at it in a reasonable way. But it is the consequence of the way in which policy is formulated, and actually policy in terms of both climate change and food security is being made for all the right reasons in the European Union, but it shows the lack of flexibility and ability to adapt from a policy perspective when there are obvious conflicts in terms of both climate change and food security policy clearly evident now. I think that one of the positives of today is that we are seeing, I hope, real engagement between policymakers, arms of the state, and industry. I think we need more of that. We need to understand how your companies work, what your ambitions are, and how we can put policies and supports in place to ensure that you are encouraged to pursue ambitious agendas around sustainability. We're trying to do that in Ireland by implementing what Aidan referred to earlier as the Food Harvest Plan. One of the advantages of being a small country, as opposed to large ones, and there are many of them, our closest neighbour being the best example. One of the advantages of being a small country is that you can bring people together that represent an industry around a table, and you can collectively try and agree a way forward. And that is what we have done with the Food Harvest Plan. The previous government put it in place, written essentially by the industry and stakeholders in the industry, and now we are implementing it. And we meet every month to assess progress. We set targets for ourselves quarterly, and those targets change all the time. We have representation in that group from farmers, primary producers, from processors, from exporters, from people who are marketing, from scientists, from state agencies like Bord Bia and Enterprise Ireland and Bord Iascaigh, who are our development agency for the seafood sector. And we challenge each other all the time. So if we feel that farmers are not prepared for the challenges that they're going to face next month or next year, we try to figure out a way to help them do that. If we feel that processors aren't preparing themselves, for example, in the dairy industry for a new reality around expansion and growth, well, then we talk about how to deal with that. If we talk about the new markets that we need to find for Irish produce, we figure out, where should I be taking the next trade mission to? Last year it was China. This year it's the Gulf states. Later on in the year it could be Russia. Early next year it'll probably be back to China, maybe to Japan. And maybe it's to North Africa, where Ireland now sells 40 million euros of cheddar each year, to find the new markets that we need to find to expand and grow. And so we have a genuine partnership between government at the very top, including the Taoiseach, industry who are operating in Ireland as Irish companies, but also non-Irish companies who've made a home here or a place for international business. And we are trying to ensure that everybody moves together in the same direction. And you know what? It's a pretty powerful formula. 2 years ago, when I was lucky enough to become a minister, we were exporting about 8 billion euros worth of food and drink. By the end of this year, it'll be close to 10 billion and continuing to grow. And that, I think, says a lot. And so the Origin Green programme has come out of that food harvest strategy, whereby people were challenging each other in terms of, what do we need to do next? How does Ireland stay credible? We can't simply say that we're just going to produce more food and expect everybody to buy it. We certainly can't do that if we want to target premium markets. There needs to be something more here. What are our companies doing that actually will gain them traction and respect, that can help them build brands and build trust with their clients? And we came to the view that sustainability was what it was really about. We are privileged to live in an island where we grow grass for fun, by and large, where we have more rain than we like, but enough rain to make sure that we stay green. And we want to use our competitive advantage there and look at the international challenge around sustainability and how food is produced. And we want to measure our path of improvement and the journey that Aidan Cotter talks about in terms of the systems that he's putting in place. And we want to partner with the best companies in the world who know how to do that. The Nestle's, the PepsiCo's, the Mars, the Tesco's, the McDonald's, the Kerry Groups, the Glanbias, and all the others who are here today talking to each other, understanding what each other are doing, sharing information so that everybody gets better at what they do. And so can I leave you with this challenge? Because I think sometimes that when we talk about food security and climate change in the European Union or in Ireland, we're talking on the basis of a theoretical concept, because we're not really touched by it. You know, if there is a food shortage in Germany, they import more food. If there's a food shortage in the UK, it's the same. When we talk about climate change, we generally talk about it in the context of the developing world. For many people in this room, listening to this discussion, this is much more real and much more painful in terms of its consequences for food producers in your countries, and indeed so-called consumers, in some cases that only have $2 a day to spend. And so the challenge I would set for you is, who is going to show the leadership here to meet the extraordinary challenges that we know are coming our way? Are we doing enough in our companies to actually inspire people, as Stan McCarthy says, to do things differently? One of the differences between sustainability and I think some of the other things that you do in your businesses is that in many ways you look at what consumers want and you deliver it to them and they pay for it. Sustainability is a little different, because I think you actually have to educate consumers around what you're doing, and as we heard earlier, not in a preachy way, but in terms of using your brands to actually encourage consumer behavior that is much more sustainable than in the past, and actually playing to the strengths that will actually encourage them to change their habits around their own personal worlds as opposed to saving the planet. And I often think when you look at surveys like we heard earlier, and you see that 50% of people want to be a good global citizen, I'm sorry, but as a politician, I'm a bit cynical about that. Because I think that is the box that people like to tick because it makes them feel good about themselves. But actually, when they're not ticking boxes, do people really want to be a good global citizen? And will they spend their money to be a good global citizen? I'm not sure they will. And that's why we need leaders in this area. And I don't mean people who just preach about it and talk about it and come to conferences and speak about it, although that's important too. I mean people who will change the behavior within companies, use the intellectual capacity within branding and marketing within companies to change the perception of consumers around brands for the right reasons. Around challenging people like me and my boss, who you saw earlier, to do more, to ensure that Ireland can actually show the way in terms of how countries can do things better. And I hope that we will get an element of that in the aftermath of this conference, because what I really do not want to see happen here, having brought all of these influential, smart, ambitious, and thoughtful people to Ireland for this conference, when we all head back to our countries and our businesses, we need to ensure that there is real motivation there for change in the right direction around sustainability. So I look forward to talking to you, many of you later on at dinner. This project is part of a project that is called The Gathering, which was about bringing people home to Ireland who may have left, many of them for all the wrong reasons. But it's also about bringing new friends, new partners, new people who we're doing business with here to Ireland to actually see for themselves the source of the product that you're buying, where it comes from, who produces it, how is it produced, the infrastructure that is there to ensure that you get the consistency, the safety, the sustainability, the measurement tools that you demand for your businesses so that Irish-sourced products will not let you down. And that is why, in many ways, for me, this is the most important project of The Gathering. Ireland's food history is full of pain, tragedy, but now ambition and positivity as we try to be part of an economic recovery in this country. And if ever there was a project that was suitable to bring people to Ireland from around the world for, I think the food story and where we want to take it is the best example of that. So I hope you will have taken some inspiration from what we are trying to do as a little country who wants to be a big player in global food security and in sustainability and climate change arguments, and that you'll take that message home with you. Thank you very much.